All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Parker. I am an instructor in the Department of Animal and Rangeland Sciences here at Oregon State University. And I'm also the manager of the Clark Meat Science Center, which is one of our units within the department that we use for teaching, research, and extension and outreach. And I'm happy to be invited here to discuss meat quality parameters and kind of the science behind pasture-raised meat. And that will be the topic of today's discussion. And I guess a little bit about how I got into this. So I graduated with a bachelor's of science in ag business in 2012 from Oregon State. And I worked at the meat lab as an undergrad. And I guess through happenstance, I stuck around here long enough to be offered a graduate research position to get a master's of science in animal science with an emphasis on meat science. My research for my master's was actually looking at hazelnut finished pork and various meat quality parameters, which I will actually talk a little bit about in the presentation. And then a couple of years ago in 2020, I decided I wasn't busy enough and there wasn't enough going on in the world. I decided to take on a PhD within the department. And my PhD research, I actually just concluded my last experiment, is looking at spent hemp biomass effect on growth parameters of livestock. So I did an experiment with sheep. And then I just concluded one with poultry, with broilers, and then looking at meat quality parameters as well. So kind of interesting research and very relevant to the state of Oregon, definitely, and also the nation, as well as more hemp is being produced. So, but back to the topic at hand here, we're going to get into forage-based systems. And quickly looking at our outline and objectives. So we're going to start off by discussing livestock finishing and carcass evaluation and traits. So going over how to know when an animal is finished through visual appraisal or by looking at its age or its weight, and then how that will affect the carcass composition too. So we'll talk about yield and quality grading. And then we'll get into specific meat quality characteristics. And we'll talk a lot about fat composition. That's one of the most heralded aspects of forage-based systems, is how forages can affect the fat composition of livestock through a number of different factors that have a lot of benefits. And there's a few drawbacks as well that we will discuss. We'll focus on the nutritive value of meat from these animals and sensory characteristics. Shelf life and further processing, and namely when we talk about further processing, when we fabricate a carcass and then make ground product such as sausage out of it. And then we'll round things out by discussing parasite concerns, which may be an issue in pasture-based systems, a couple of the common ones, and some ways that you might mitigate that. All right, so starting off with livestock finishing. So there's this interplay of physiological age of the animal versus the chronological age of the animal. So chronological age obviously is, if you have birth records on the animal, you know exactly how many months or years it is old. But physiological age is, we use other ways to assess that. So it's conformation and perhaps it's lean maturity and skeletal maturity, which I'll talk about here in the next slide. But essentially how old it is based off of its genetics, whether it's a late maturing animal, early maturing, things of that nature. And we have to use physiological age more or less because it's going to tell us when muscle development begins to slow and fattening begins, that might be the time to harvest the animal. So I have a couple different graphs up here. The first is the carcass tissue proportion in beef cattle. And when we talk carcass tissues, we're talking about muscle, fat, and bone. So early in the animal's development, after it's born, a very high proportion of its growth is going to be bone. So it's going to be developing bone and muscle and not as much fat. but as it goes along through its lifespan, it begins to see a decrease in bone formation, so it begins to ossify, and muscle accretion begins to slow as well. So with beef cattle, for example, in a traditional conventional grain-fed system, you're going to be looking normally at 16 to 18 months of age of that animal when you see muscling begin to taper off and fattening begin. Now, you don't want to slaughter an animal when it's excessively fat, because what that's going to do is hurt the yield grade, or what we'll discuss as the percentage of saleable meat that you will get off the animal. So we have to assess its physiological age in determining when it's the right time to slaughter that animal and begin selling the products from it. Now, there's a number of factors that affect finishing. So obviously species, you can't treat lamb, pork, and beef the same. They're all going to mature at different rates. Also, within a species, breed and genetics. So I refer to late versus early maturing animals. Now, a late maturing animal, for a longer period of its life, it's going to be still developing muscle and bone and then fattening at a later portion of its life, versus an early maturing animal or a short-framed animal where it will develop its muscle and bone relatively early on and will be ready to slaughter at an earlier time compared to late maturing animals. So again, this all relates back to its physiological age. Sex of the animal as well. Typically, females will fatten and be ready to harvest earlier than males, all of the factors being equal. And also, getting back to kind of the premise of this presentation is the nutritional plane of what it's eating. So, you can have the best genetics in the world, but it has to, for phenotypic variations in the animal, has to have the right environment and the right type of feed to express the outward potential as far as muscling or intramuscular fat deposition, things like that. And nutrition is a big factor in that. Now, with cattle, in a forage-based diet, on average, it may take 4 to 6 months longer on feed to achieve the same carcass characteristics, same finishing weight, maybe the same amount of intramuscular fat deposition as grain-fed or grain-finished cattle. And that's because, on average, forage is going to be lower in energy and protein content, or isocaloric and isonitrogenous factors, compared to grain. So we can see a graph here of beef carcasses with their hot carcass weight and also the amount of intramuscular fat. And you can see, on average, they're going to have a higher percentage of intramuscular fat and also a higher hot carcass weight comparatively to cattle, forage-fed cattle of the same age. So again, factoring in, physiological age, and does your animal need more time if it's in a pasture-based system to achieve these same markers in the carcass. So next we'll look at finishing characteristics in these animals. So you could do one of two things. In some, we use a visual appraisal of whether or not it's ready to be harvested. In others, we can weigh them and we can actually have, some quantifiable numbers to let us know if it's time. Now for beef, for example, what you might be looking at, and just kind of, I'll use this picture up here as a reference, is the amount of fat that would be deposited over the tail head. So that's back here on the rump on both sides of the tail. If it's relatively full on both sides, that's telling us that it's depositing quite a bit of subcutaneous fat, that it might be ready. A smooth barrel over the chest here would indicate that fat is filling in between the ribs, in between that intercostal muscle. So a nice smooth barrel is an indication that fattening is happening. If you look from a back view, spread legs is indicating that fat is being deposited in the back leg. And then probably the best indicator is brisket fill. So if a brisket kind of looks like it's hanging down, and oftentimes the reference gets made that a basketball or something is inside of the brisket there and it's hanging low, is a good indication that there is ample fattening in that animal and it's ready to be slaughtered. Now with pork, it's more or less going to be based upon age of the animal. Now, normally market hogs are going to be slaughtered around 6 to 8 months of age, and they'll be around 250 to 275 pounds. That's not to say, based off of other factors, that they could be, less than that or more than that, but on average, it's going to be somewhere in this range. But you can also visually assess them. So we can look at how pronounced the muscling is through the shoulder and also through the loin, and then also through the rump. And a lot of times in a carcass, what you'd be looking for if you take half of a side of pork would be almost a barbell shape. So kind of big up towards the top, and then kind of gets slender and then bulks back out around the shoulder. Now, again, with lamb, it's going to be predominantly age-based. Normally, lamb are going to be 6 to 8 months old when they are slaughtered. And if they get any older, normally maybe a year or so of chronological age, they're going to be considered mutton. And oftentimes we don't want to slaughter lamb if it's going to be considered mutton, because it's going to intensify in flavor and also is going to become less tender as it gets to that age, which is usually why they're slaughtered at a younger age. As far as looking at a visual appraisal to let us know when the animal is ready to be slaughtered, we can look at fat deposition, subcutaneous fat, that is, over the lumbar region. So especially if the lamb is sheared, you can run your hand over this and it should be relatively smooth, indicating there's ample fat fill right there, no slippage when you do that. And also, again, muscle definition in the rump and then also in the loin should be relatively pronounced. Okay, so that's all fine and well, but how does this correlate to the carcass and what that's going to mean as far as how the animal is going to taste and also how much meat we're going to get off of that carcass? So we break this up into two criteria. First, we have what's called yield grade. So the term that we always associate with yield grade is called cutability. And this is going to be the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, or the amount of saleable meat that you will get off of a carcass. Now, beef and lamb, the scale goes from 1 to 5. Now, 1 and 2 would be ideal. That means that the animal is excessively muscled, minimally fat, and in layman's terms, you're going to have more meat to sell off of that carcass once you fabricate it. 3 in both species is going to be average, and then conversely, 4 and 5 will be less ideal. That means the carcass is excessively fat, and you're probably going to have to trim more of that fat off once it's all said and done, and it goes into a package to be sold. Pork will be on a 1 to 4, and it's the same principle that's going to apply there. A 1 is going to be the best, 4 is going to be the worst. And you can see some examples with beef yield grades over here. A lot of this is going to be based initially off of the amount of back fat or subcutaneous fat. So a good indication would be like right here on this USDA yield grade 4. That is deposited. Now, normally if there's a lot of back fat, that's usually going to be a detriment to it. Another thing that you have to look at is how big this ribeye area is. So on these cross sections here, this carcass, and this would be the same with lamb too, is split at the 12th and 13th rib interface. So here is the center of the vertebral column, the midline. What you do is you'd go about 3/4 of the way up where this longissimus muscle is, or the loin, and then you take the measurement of how thick from the outside of the muscle to the outside of the fat, how much back fat there is. That gives you what's called your preliminary yield grade, and then you would adjust from there based off of other factors such as the weight of the carcass, the amount of ribeye area. So a bigger ribeye here is going to be beneficial. It means there's more muscling. And then also the amount of KPH, which stands for kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. Now that would be the internal fat, the cod fat up around the pelvis. If there's a lot of that in there, that's indicating that the carcass, again, is excessively fat. So just looking at this, here's some examples of based off of back fat, what the yield grade here would receive. Now, quality is going to be a little bit different, and quality is always correlating to palatability. And palatability is flavor, aroma, juiciness, tenderness of cooked meat from that carcass. Now, normally, physiological age of the animal, the younger the better, is going to be more beneficial, because that's going to indicate that it's going to be more tender. There's going to be less connective tissue or heat stable connective tissue, which we'll talk about here in a few slides. And what you would look at as far as physiological age would be first the skeletal maturity. A lot of the time, especially in beef, you're going to be assessing the vertebral column and the amount of ossification. So normally a higher presence of cartilage indicates that it's a physiologically young animal. And then you could also look at the color of the lean of a freshly cut face of a muscle. So a pink, bright cherry red indicates that it's a physiologically younger animal. And that is due to, as an animal gets older, it deposits more of a muscle pigment called myoglobin. Myoglobin is a protein in meat that gives meat its color. And we'll talk about that here when we start to get into meat quality characteristics. So a lighter coloration, more cartilage indicates a physiologically younger animal and makes them eligible to receive these different quality grades for the animal. So looking at different aspects, you have USDA select and then choice. You have a range of 3 different designations there, and then you get up into prime. And this is also going to be based off of marbling. Now, marbling is the amount of intramuscular fat that's deposited at that 12th and 13th rib interface in our ribeye right there. So as more is deposited and evenly and equally deposited throughout the ribeye there, it's going to be beneficial. It's going to mean that you're going to essentially have more palatability. It's going to have a better eating quality to it. That's why if you have a prime, marbled piece of meat, it has a lot of those flecks of fat throughout the entire area right there in the ribeye. Now, with pork, it's not necessarily based off of marbling. Pork, more or less, is going to look at whether it has or doesn't have any defects due to color. Now, pale, soft, and exudative would be this condition right here, and these are cross sections of a pork leg or a ham. And what this is normally a stress at slaughter, right before slaughter, that causes a severe drop in the pH of the muscle post-mortem. So it's acid meat, essentially. And when this happens, we call it pale because it exudes a lot of its water. Now, muscle is on average 75% water. When the pH drops significantly, proteins in the muscle denature prematurely, and they lose their ability to hold on to that water. So it goes to the surface of the cut face here. It reflects more light, giving it a pale appearance. So this would be an indication of low pH from short-term stress. Now we have an opposite condition over here called dark, firm, and dry, and this is actually high pH. This means that the animal may have been stressed long-term. It might have been taken off of feed, which is a common practice. Fasting is a common practice at slaughter, and wasn't, after it was transported to a facility, wasn't put back on feed to replenish glycogen. Glycogen is what's being broken down post-mortem that's dropping the pH. So that means that the glycogen, when the animal was alive, has already been depleted. So there's not nearly as much of a pH drop post-mortem. So it's actually holding on to much more water, and it's allowing more light to penetrate the surface of the meat, giving it a darker appearance. Now, this PSE condition right here, as far as quality grade, would be a reason to, likely not use meat from a pork carcass. This is what we definitely don't want to see because it's not ideal color-wise to a consumer. And it also has poor binding qualities to make sausage out of. Now, conversely, even though the dark, firm, and dry may not be the most beneficial for color to a consumer, it actually has ideal binding characteristics and is more preferred than anything to make sausage out of. But ideally, what we're going for, if we're going to make a pork chop or something like that, a retail cut that's going to go out on the shelf, is going to be something that's more of a normal color, normal pH, what we call red, firm, and non-exudative. So not necessarily with pork looking at marbling although that is something that you might be able to factor in, but you don't commonly see pork being marketed as, choice or prime or things of that nature. Now, it's important to note that a good yield grade does not necessarily mean a good quality grade. And oftentimes in forage-fed beef cattle that I've graded, you might have something that's a yield grade 1 or 2, and that's great for saleable meat. However, that does not translate into being prime over here. We'll talk about that regarding fat composition. So just keep that in mind, that if something yield grades well, does not mean it's going to quality grade the same. So this all relates to this premise of fat composition and how this influences or how forage can influence this in the animal. So what the animal eats, its diet, is going to profoundly affect its fat composition, or what we call fatty acid composition, in its meat tissues. Now, there's a difference between monogastrics like pigs and chickens compared to that of ruminants like cattle and sheep. So because monogastrics just have a single stomach, they more readily deposit what they eat into their tissues as they are. Now, ruminants go through a process due to the microbes in their digestive system called biohydrogenation, which hydrogenates dietary lipids so they're more saturated. So that is to say that normally monogastrics will have a more unsaturated fat profile compared to ruminants, but we'll talk about that here in a second. Now, as far as fat and how it's deposited in the carcass, it's based by and large off of the biological needs of the animal and what are called depots. So I have a table over here that shows the different depots. These first two are internal fat. So this would be the KPH that I was referencing earlier, the cod fat, fat that's around the vital organs. Our next depot is going to be intermuscular fat. And you can see down here, I have a cross section of a beef rib, just to kind of give you an idea of where these different depots would be in a meat cut. Intermuscular fat is going to be deposited between different muscle groups. So right here we have the loin or the longissimus muscle. And then up here, this is the spinalis dorsi. And you can see there's a big chunk of fat deposited in between that. That's intramuscular fat. Our second to last depot is subcutaneous fat. And this is what we referred to as back fat earlier. So it's on the very outside of the carcass. And then the last depot is going to be intramuscular fat or marbling. As you can see inside the longissimus here, it's those flecks of fat that are deposited between the paramecial layers of connective tissue within the muscle. Now, this is important because marbling, as I mentioned earlier, is ideal for quality. So what this means is that the animal's plane of nutrition, in order to deposit intramuscular fat, has to have adequate fat in all of these other depots as well. It has to fully be depositing them in the other depots first to then deposit intramuscular fat inside of the muscle. This is why grain-fed cattle on a high-energy diet will typically put on marbling a little bit sooner than a forage-fed animal, because a forage-fed animal might still be developing these depots first before they put on the intramuscular fat, which again goes back to that maybe 4 to 6 extra months on forage to realize this type of fat deposition. So we get into the science of this. Many studies have shown that forage-based diets increase what are called long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids in meat tissues compared to that of grain-based diets. So, and that's the most notable thing when we are discussing forage-based systems and grass-fed or grass-finished meat, is how that can influence the fat composition in a beneficial way. So when looking at forages, so grasses, forbs, legumes, things of that nature, they are high in long-chain fatty acids compared to that of grain, and grain primarily being corn and soy. So we'll kind of look at these two different types of fats. We have our saturated fats. I'll just abbreviate that as SFA. These have no double bonds in this carbon chain. So a fatty acid is consisting of a carbon chain. You have a methyl end and a carboxyl end. And then if a fatty acid has a double bond at one of these carbons, it's called an unsaturated fat. And that's if it has one or more. Now, our monounsaturated fats, or MUFA, have at least or have one double bond. And this is actually the most abundant type of fat in all of livestock. So this oleic acid is the most abundant fatty acid in livestock, no matter the diet. Now, when we start getting into polyunsaturated fats, or PUFA, that's when you have two or more double bonds in this carbon chain. So here would be an example of a double bond. And down here, the two most prominent are going to be your linoleic acid. This would be an omega-6 fatty acid right here, where you have two double bonds. And an omega-3 is where you have three double bonds right here. And oftentimes these omega-3s are heralded as being very good for human health. And studies have shown that forage-based diets increase these PUFAs in meat tissues compared to grain. Additionally, what's important is that we can see a concurrent decrease in these saturated type fats. And saturated fats, namely palmitic acid, stearic acid, are known for being high in cholesterol. We'll talk about that in the next slide. So this offers benefits through trying to create an ideal fat profile through the feeding system in the animal and then the meat that we are consuming off of that. But there's other, besides just nutritional value of the meat, it's going to affect the sensory characteristics and also the shelf life and further processing characteristics as well of the meat that we are sourcing from these animals. But first, getting into nutritive value in human health. So getting back to these omega-3 fatty acids, they're again heralded as being anti-inflammatory, and what they do is they help with cellular maintenance and repair in the human body. And there's been a multitude of studies that have shown increasing the amount of omega-3s that we consume dietarily decreases the risk of cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancer, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. So very, very good, very beneficial to human health. And forage-fed animals are a significant source of this. Additionally, we have this other type of fatty acid in which forage-finished animals are often heralded as being a great source of, and that's these conjugated linoleic acids, so an omega-6, with a we call a cis9 and trans11 isomer. So the way that it goes through elongation and desaturation as it's being metabolized in the animal's body. And these also have other beneficial health effects on humans. So it helps with obesity and weight loss in humans, diabetes mitigation, cardiovascular disease, and cancer as well. And it's not just forage-fed meat, but also milk is another great source of these CLAs too. Now, we can also increase monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids in the animal's diet, which, as I mentioned earlier, we can see a decrease in the saturated fats of the animal. So I mentioned earlier in my intro that I did a study feeding hazelnuts, which are very high in monounsaturated fats, to pigs. And what we saw was a decrease in the amount of palmitic acid, which is a saturated fat, and an increase in uptick in monounsaturated fat. And this is important because those types of fatty acids, these saturated fats, are high in LDL cholesterol. So this shows that we can lower the amount of LDL cholesterol that we are consuming, or the quote unquote bad cholesterol that causes things like atherosclerosis and increases the risk of stroke and heart attack in humans. And overall, forage-fed animals are going to have, by and large, leaner carcasses. So total fat is going to be lower compared to grain-fed or grain-finished animals. Now, I would be remiss, and I've already kind of alluded to it, if I didn't discuss, tree nuts and how, beneficial those are, especially in pasture-raised pork. A lot of pasture-raised pork, they especially in Oregon, they might be consuming hazelnuts or acorns, a very popular thing, especially in Europe with Iberian pork, in which, along with grasses, they are also consuming nuts that fall on the ground too. And what's aside from being high in monounsaturated fats, these nuts are also high in fat-soluble vitamins and minerals and other phenols and antioxidants. So notably, we have vitamin E. So the hazelnuts that I dealt with are very high in vitamin E or alpha tocopherol. Vitamin A is very high in grasses too. We know that as beta carotene, and also selenium. So it has this antioxidant that's very beneficial called glutathione peroxidase. And these things are very good at mitigating oxidative stability in the body and also in the cuts of meat as far as shelf life as well when we are trying to market these products. So fat is going to be very consequential in the products that we are sourcing from these animals, not just in relation to the nutritive value that imparts to humans, but other aspects of meat quality too, and things that we experience from animals that we source from forage-fed systems. So kind of getting into the sensory characteristics and talking about what makes meat have a certain flavor or aroma. By and large, predominantly, it's going to be dictated by its fat composition. So that's mostly responsible for what you will experience taste-wise, and also the way it might smell as you are cooking it up, and the way the fats break down, especially when you apply heat to them. Now, of course, this is going to differ by species, and we've already kind of alluded to this with the difference between monogastrics and ruminants and the fatty acids that predominate in them. Now, quite a few studies have shown that in forage-fed animals, the increase in omega-3 fats, although great for the nutritive value of the meat, can often lead to more objectionable types of compounds denoted in consumers in trials in which they've fed them these samples, more of a fishy or gamey flavor to it. Additionally, the color of the lean may be darker, and I have a side-by-side photograph here of a grass-fed beef ribeye and a grain-fed beef ribeye, and what I'm trying to illustrate there is the difference in the color of the lean and also the color of the fat. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but increases in myoglobin, especially if the animal is older, will lead to darker coloration of the lean. Now, if you are, let's go back to our example of raising beef in a pasture system, you might have to keep them on the pasture 4 to 6 months longer. Now, they will be chronologically older, and that will, allow them to deposit more myoglobin into their muscle throughout that time as well, compared to an animal that was slaughtered at a younger age. And we also could potentially see a recruitment in more red type fibers. So in muscle fibers, you can't really see it, but there is always a combination of white fibers, which are glycolytic, and red fibers, which are oxidative, which have more myoglobin. And then we have these intermediate fibers too. So for example, when we exercise, let's say that we want to work on our biceps and we start lifting weights, what we're trying to recruit are more white type fast twitch fibers, which allow us to do quick bursts of energy, move heavy things for a short period of time, but get fatigued relatively easily. Versus if we're training for a marathon, you might start running on a treadmill or going for, a run around town. You're recruiting more of your intermediate red type fibers, which are more oxidative. And consequently, you're going to be recruiting more myoglobin into those muscles. So let's say an animal out on pasture, it's raised extensively, it has the ability to exercise and walk around. It might be recruiting more of those red type fibers, giving it a darker color. And then lastly, it may also be a pH condition. So normally, especially corn is going to have a high amount of glycogen that's going to be deposited in grain-fed animals. So the more glycogen that's in their muscle postmortem, they're going to be going through glycolysis a little bit longer with more of a pH drop. Compared to maybe a grass-finished or grass-fed animal, it's going to have less glycogen. Its glycolysis is going to halt sooner, so you're going to have a less severe pH drop Again, more light penetration, less water exuding to the surface, giving it a darker appearance. So it's not to say it's going to be one of these or the other. It could be a combination of all of those. But if you ever, see the darker coloration in forage-fed animals and carcasses and meat cuts that come from them, that's likely what that's attributed to. And then we also have this this condition of the fat, and you can definitely see it here in these two photos. In the grass-fed ribeye, the fat is definitely darker and more yellow, and that's simply attributed to beta carotene, or that vitamin A that's found in grasses. A lot of the time, folks think that that's from the corn, from grain-fed animals. It's actually the opposite. The corn is going to result in this white coloration of the fat right here. And that's not to say that it's bad or anything like that, but that's just a coloration pigment issue. Now, as far as tenderness and texture and how the feeding system might affect that, this is going to be highly dependent. Well, back up. A number of things can affect the tenderness and texture of a cut of meat. But getting into things that maybe a producer can control is going to be the age of the animal and how much intramuscular fat that you can deposit into that animal through a feeding system. Now, as animals become older, they develop more heat-stable connective tissue, and this does not break down very easily, especially under dry heat cooking. So if you take a ribeye and you throw that on a grill from an animal that's older and has a lot of this heat-stable connective tissue in it, it's probably not going to be as tender as a younger animal that doesn't have as much of that heat-stable connective tissue in its muscle. And a way that you can kind of mitigate this, I have this, this diagram over here, is that I mentioned that intramuscular fat is deposited between the paramecial layer of the muscle bundles that make up a whole muscle. And when that adipose tissue from intramuscular fat is deposited between those muscle bundles, it has a way of breaking up this connective tissue. So in essence, it's helping with tenderness by depositing more fat in between that. And that fat also acts as a lubricant in our mouths when we are eating it. That's going to give it a perceived sense of tenderness as well. So a couple things that you can do, that's why we try to slaughter animals at a younger age. But again, as I mentioned earlier, with grass-fed animals or forage-based systems, it might be kind of hard to experience the same amount of intramuscular fat at the same age, chronological age, of a grain-fed animal. So you do the best you can. You try to kind of, hit that interplay of those two things where the animal's not too old, where it's going to be, very tough when you go to eat that. Now, all of that being said, several studies have shown that consumers still find forage-fed meats desirable and acceptable compared to grain-finished animals. So it's not the end of the world necessarily if you're not going to get the same amount of marbling in one versus the other. Okay, so how do all these things affect how long we can store the meat and how long it's going to be good for, and a few other things like, making sausage out of forage-fed carcasses and meat products. So there's a lot of good things about polyunsaturated fats and omega-3s in the nutritive value of meat. However, because they have more double bonds, they have longer chains, they are going to be more prone to lipid oxidation and are probably going to spoil faster versus something that's grain-fed. That's because we have these things called free radicals. So you have singlet oxygen, for example, and this just kind of shows a pathway of what happens during lipid oxidation. That forms what are called hydroxyl radicals, and they go through this propagation process and form peroxyl radicals and lipid peroxides. And these are the things that you detect, you can smell during rancidity and spoilage. These are the things that we're trying to prevent. So unfortunately, these double bonds in unsaturated lipids are targets for these free radicals. So the more double bonds there are, the more targets there are to what's called abstract the hydrogens and then start forming these byproducts that are bad during oxidation. Furthermore, when these lipid byproducts are formed, they have a way of destabilizing myoglobin, the pigment that gives meat its color, and it leads to premature protein denaturation and color loss. And essentially, the meat will turn browner quicker. It goes from what's called oxymyoglobin in fresh red meat that you might see over here to this brown coloration, this oxidized form called met myoglobin. And this is what we're trying to prevent as far as color. Now, color is very, very important in the meat industry. It's the number one thing that consumers are going to look at. They're going to, visually appraise something on the shelf, whether or not it looks wholesome and appetizing to them based off of this conditioning to think that the bright cherry red color is the best. And, that's going to dictate to them whether or not they buy it. So we're trying to keep, a lot of meat science research is trying to stabilize color and keep that oxymyoglobin redox phase as long as we can and try to prevent this met myoglobin from forming. And the good news about forage-based systems is that they are very high in antioxidants and these phenolic compounds. And because of this, they suppress lipid oxidation. So they scavenge these free radicals that are formed during oxidation. They donate electrons, essentially, is what's happening. And they stabilize these products to a more stable type of compound that is not going to oxidize. So you take the good with the bad there. Yes, the polyunsaturated fats are more prone to oxidation, but forage-based systems also do incorporate more antioxidants into their tissues and help mitigate some of that. And over here is just kind of helping illustrate vitamin E supplementation in steaks or cattle that were supplemented with vitamin E. So on the left, you have cattle that were supplemented with 370 international units of vitamin E in the form of alpha tocopherol acetate versus cattle that were supplemented with nothing. And they did a shelf life study, and you can see through 12 days that the ones that were supplemented with vitamin E still have quite a bit of redness versus the ones that weren't. They have fully oxidized into met myoglobin. So it does have a very profound effect on being able to suppress this oxidation. Now, getting into more processed meats, comminuted ground products, sausages, things of that nature, these PUFAs that forage-based systems are higher in will have a lower melting point compared to saturated fats and monounsaturated fats. And unfortunately, this is probably going to lead to, if you're not careful, a breakdown in our batter. So I often liken making a sausage to, kind of like baking a cake, if you will. You have your ingredients you throw in there, and granted, sausage isn't a true liquid, but you put your ingredients in there, you heat it up, you denature your proteins, and it sets that product into a gel. Much like when you pull the cake out of the oven, it's in a solid form. And the idea is to keep all of those constituents, all of those solutes in your product together. You don't want this condition over here. This is called fatting out or rendering out, where the fat is not entrapped inside of your sausage mix. It melts very easily, so it coalesces, and then you get these big globules that coat the surface, or you get these big fat pockets as well. That's what we don't want. And because polyunsaturated fats have such a low melting point, it doesn't take much to further their surface area to cause them to coalesce, especially given the fact that we're using processing equipment like grinders, choppers, stuffers, and other equipment that is adding friction heat into that equation. So a way to mitigate this, if you are making products out of animals from forage-based systems that are higher in these PUFAs, is to have good temperature controls. So in your cooler, in your processing room, I would start off with having meat that is partially frozen. Meat will freeze around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So we, typically when making sausage here or ground product, we start off with semi-frozen meat. And it, helps mitigate that issue with having this fatting out condition in our products. And you can also add ingredients too. So making sure that you're getting proper protein extraction, you're adding enough salt. Salt is what extracts proteins when you make sausage, which makes them available to bind water and encapsulate fat and keep everything together in your mix. Additionally, so again, kind of getting back to pork, because I don't want to leave pork out. I know we don't often think of pork when we think of pasture-raised meats, but they do definitely have a place and a niche there. Incorporation of forages and tree nuts in pork diets do create an ideal fat profile. So the addition of more monounsaturated fats and also these antioxidants for dry cured and dry aged products. So think of prosciutto, copa, things like that. And the model for this is going to be Iberian pork from Spain and Italy. So those animals are raised in what's called a Montañera system. So they're raised extensively, they're on pasture, they're consuming acorns. Those acorns very high in monounsaturated fats and also high in alpha tocopherol or vitamin E. Same with the grasses. If you have a profile for pork, especially that is too high in polyunsaturated fats, it's not going to be good for long-term aging and drying because it gets back to that worry of increased oxidation that we discussed earlier. All right, so lastly, we're not going to talk about all of the different pathogens that would be a concern in meat products because they're not specific to a pasture system necessarily, but parasites are, and there's a couple of note that we'll discuss here. And the first is Trichinella spiralis. So this is a parasitic nematode. And what this does is that it will encysst itself in the muscle of a host. And then let's say we'll get back to pork, for example. Pork are out rooting around in pasture and they find a mouse or something and they eat that mouse. That mouse has the trichinella. It will then be, deposited into the pig. And what it does is it reproduces and matures in the intestinal tract. And then once it gets mature enough, it will then mobilize itself into the bloodstream and then into the muscle and will encysst itself, just like this over here, into the muscle of the host until that host is then, consumed by something else. Now, in the commercial pork industry, this has largely been eradicated because in the commercial pork industry, the pigs are fed primarily corn and soy, and they are raised indoors, in places that have pest management programs and things of that nature. However, with pasture-raised pork, this could be a concern because, as I mentioned earlier, they're out rooting around and they might, get into something that has this parasite in it. The good news is that as a concern in a meat product, if you cook meat to the proper temperature, so in this case, 160 degrees Fahrenheit, or you freeze meat at less than 5 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 20 days, or if you're making a cured product, you use sodium nitrite, the chances of that having any effect on you are basically slim to none. So there's a lot of ways that we can manage and mitigate this in meat products. Another one that is in a concern for pork and lamb is this Toxoplasmosis gondii, and this is a parasite, a protozoan parasite. And believe it or not, house cats are a common reservoir for this parasite. You can kind of see a pathway over here of these cysts that get into felines and then they defecate. And let's say, your sheep are out, foraging in the pasture and your cat's out there and it may have defecated out there and they happen to eat around that area, or your pig does, then it will be the new host for the parasite. But the thing about toxoplasmosis is it's fairly ubiquitous. It's estimated that around half the world population has been infected with this or has it. But the good news is that very few people will actually exhibit symptoms of this infection. Now, I did some digging on this. So the worry with meat products from these animals is that undercooked pork and lamb may be a human route to infection. So that's how we might get this parasitic infection. But they did a study here a couple of years ago, actually, where they randomly selected pasture-raised pork and pasture-raised lamb from various retail outlets and did an analysis to see the viable concentrations of this toxoplasmosis parasite. Only 1 out of 750 pork samples and only 2 out of 750 lamb samples contained viable traces of this. So yes, I guess it could be a concern, but a highly relevant one, not necessarily according to a study. Again, getting back to how you can mitigate this when you consume these products, cooking the meat to at least 145 degrees Fahrenheit will kill it. And then also, and this is a good practice with any meat product, is avoiding cross-contamination between raw product and cooked product. All right, well, that's about all I have for you. Here's my contact information. If you guys want to follow up about anything regarding this, I'd be happy to discuss it with you. And thank you all for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's, as far as marbling goes and things like that, those ideal traits for palatability can be very hard to predict. That's why we're kind of using, especially in beef cattle, we're using the amount of subcutaneous fat or brisket fill or the amount of fat that's deposited that we can outwardly see to determine that, getting back to the fat depots, that subcutaneous fat depot is fully developed, and any more fat from the diet is going to be deposited intramuscularly and, is going to be marbling. They do make these fancy machines. I doubt a lot of people would have access to them. We have one here at the university for teaching purposes, but it's an ultrasound that you can actually put over the rib area or the loin and see how, well, you can see a number of things, how big the ribeye area is going to be. And also it will show you the amount of intramuscular fat that's in there. But again, that's not a very, logical thing that a lot of people are going to have access to on the farm. So you have to use kind of those visual appraisals. And that's not to say that, intramuscular fat is the end all be all, because, a lot of the marketability of pasture-raised animals is maybe a lack of fat or the leanness to it, the health benefits, getting back to, how fat affects nutritive value is the right type of fat. It's the omega-3s or the conjugated linoleic acids and an overall leaner profile. If you have a very severe pH drop where it's close to what's called the isoelectric point, that's when meat will really start to purge its liquid. And essentially this isoelectric point is the same amount of positive and negative protein charges. And what happens is, because there's the same amount of positive and negatives, they are attracted, just like a magnet, are attracted to one another. And that compresses these myofilaments of the muscle and it expels the water. Now, what that could do is lead to more acidic type of meat. It's not been my experience that might be necessarily detectable from a flavor standpoint. From a textural standpoint, it's definitely going to be noticeable. The meat, when proteins denature prematurely, they become more compact. Essentially, we're talking about exuding that water out of the muscle system. Water, if a muscle is 75% water and it's losing all of that, and these proteins are being denatured and they're compacting, you're going to have a very dry, tough cut of meat that you're going to be trying to gnaw your way through. So retaining more of that water, that moisture, that indigenous water in there is going to be beneficial. There's a lot of reasons to do things humanely, and not just from meat quality, obviously is going to be one of them, but also ethically and morally as well. But if you are doing things to stress animals at slaughter, you're definitely going to have a negative impact on the quality of the meat product that you're getting from it. Yeah, those are all really good questions. In my trial, we fed them the last 40 or so days before slaughter. So obviously it wasn't a trial that evaluated it throughout their entire lifespan. And we also used ground hazelnuts that were about 95% kernel, 5% shell. I do believe pigs have the ability to shell them and can select against the shell because the shell will contain tannins that do have anti-nutritional factors in them. We didn't see, even with the 5%, there was any really effect on their willingness to eat it or anything of that nature. The pigs that we fed hazelnuts to in different concentrations, 15% of diet and 30%, definitely were overall fatter. And one thing you have to kind of keep in mind too is that, getting back to this idea of an animal in its lifespan, when it's first developing, it's developing bone and then muscle and then fat later on. And if it doesn't have adequate protein intake, what you could see is a compensatory gain compared to other pigs that do have proper protein intake early in their lives, but the gain is going to be primarily fat. So you're going to end up with an excessively fat pig by the time it's all said and done. So I'm not sure, I can't answer that directly, if that's something that you could do throughout the entirety of its life. It might be more that it, as it gets older, it develops a way to eat those things, to eat hazelnuts and nuts, and becomes more acclimated to that. I'm not sure, earlier on in its life, if that is a viable feed source for them, since I didn't really study that early on in the animal's life. But definitely, at least towards the end, right up to slaughter, it did have a profound effect in creating a more nutritional profile. So we decreased the saturated fats, put on more monounsaturated fats too. And we also saw a little bit of extension in shelf life. We measure what's called T-bars, which is the amount of aldehydes that are produced through oxidation. And we saw a significant reduction in oxidation byproducts in the hazelnuts fed hogs compared to conventional, which bodes well, especially, and it's becoming more and more, prevalent, and a need is addressing food waste and, keeping something on the shelf for a longer period of time. If you can incorporate anything into their diet that can do that, especially, something high in antioxidants like vitamin E, then it's just a win all across the board. In our trial, it was exclusively from the hazelnuts. Now, in other systems like the Iberian pork, they're also consuming grasses as well that do have a phenolic impact as well on the total antioxidant capacity and profile of the meat. Mm-hmm. But in ours, we did not supplement with anything else. It was strictly, we're putting 15% hazelnut in one and 30% in the other. I think as a producer, you have to have realistic expectations of, perhaps how much meat you might get back or what the quality might be based on these things. And if you're feeding a bunch of hazelnuts to a pig and a lot of it is a big proportion of its carcass is back fat, well, a processor is not going to keep all of that back fat on there because the consumer doesn't want to open up a package of meat and half of the cut of meat is fats. They're probably gonna be wondering, why did you put that in there? And that's why it's important to realize the impact of a visual appraisal, or looking at your animal on the hoof and trying to get an idea of what its yield is going to be after the meat packer slaughters and cuts it up. If you're consistently, producing animals that are yield grade 4 or 5, and you're wondering, like, I gave you a 1,400-pound animal and I didn't get that much meat back from it. Well, if its yield grade is not very good, well, no, a lot of that weight is going to be in fat that's going to be trimmed off and removed. So, I always encourage, if a meat packer and processor will allow a producer into their facility to kind of see their program, and to look at a carcass and go over yield and quality grading and things like that, they'd have a better understanding and more realistic expectations of what you're going to get out of that animal that you're raising. And it only benefits you as a producer as well, because you might make some changes to your program to have a more ideal outcome of what you're looking for in the type of animal you're producing and the type of meat that you may be selling from it. I am not a forage specialist, I work with some great ones here in my department and on campus, that could tell you, seasonality and the right types of grasses and legumes, and things to incorporate into your pasture, and rotational grazing, and all of those things, in which you are maximizing the amount of crude protein or digestible energy, and all these other things that are components of your forage based system, in which those are directly being transferred into the carcass and the meat of the animal. I think if you're probably raising livestock for meat in a primarily forage based system, that you are doing so under the idea that you're going to market that to more towards health conscious consumers. That's why I did talk a lot about marbling, because marbling, it does affect palatability quite a bit, but that's not the end all be all. Again, maybe your objective is that you want an animal that's quality grading select, because that means there's less fat, and you're marketing it as a leaner cut of meat. You're not going to be selling your cattle to a steakhouse in New York that's selling a ribeye for $100. You're selling a ribeye that's low in fat, and high in omega-3 fatty acids and CLAs, and all these other benefits that forage can provide. And, if folks have any questions, feel free to drop me a line, and more than happy to answer them.